Welcome back to Fresh Outlook, everybody. I'm Logan Crawford. 36,000 Verizon workers strike, and now telecommunications experts say that as the job action drags on, service problems and delays for customers will start to crop up more and more for users of landline phones, high-speed internet, and television services. Let's say hello to our panel of experts, Alain Sanders, John Boyd, and Charles Steindel, resident scholar at Ramapo College of New Jersey. Charles, I'll start with you. What's at the heart of this job action by Verizon workers?
Okay, what's happening is Verizon's business is changing. They're going much more to wireless service. The landline connections, which includes fiber as well as copper, it's flat or down. So they're trying, it's a regulated industry. They're trying to save costs. They're not going to expand the business. So naturally, they're going to be very hard-nosed in contract negotiations. And meanwhile, the workers, they're fearful that they might not have a job in the future. So clearly they want to hold on to what they have. That, I think, is the story.
Well, if you look at what they have, Alan, they are dinosaurs. I mean, who has a landline phone anymore? Anybody here? I do. Oh, two? Okay, 2 out of 4. Okay, you guys both have a landline. So we'll be going to your house when disaster strikes because our cell phones won't work and our voice over internet provider won't work. Okay, television, believe it or not, is becoming a loser, because people are streaming their TV shows on Netflix and so forth. And they say the internet business isn't really that great either. So these folks are going to be out of work eventually.
Well, I mean, the question is how eventually, and what kind of retraining and what kind of education is the company offering for them. And I think that's part of the issue. I mean, everybody understands that industries change. Politics is always about change. Business is always about change. But how do you adapt to it, and how do you do it in a humane way? And in this particular instance, this strike comes at a particularly important moment. We're in the middle of an election campaign in which how do you deal with workers who are displaced? How do you deal with workers who are being outsourced? And there's a big question here about outsourcing. How do you deal with older workers who rely on pensions? And there's a talk about reducing pension benefits. So this strike, well, whichever side of the debate you're on, whether you're on the business side, we have to cut costs, we have to adapt, or you're on the worker side, like how do I put food on the table and pay rent, are the big issues. And that's why you saw 2 important candidates, right? Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton coming to these strikes, actually siding with the workers, because it feeds into and it plays into their campaign and their belief that yes, we have to adapt to change. Change is inevitable, but how do you do it in a humane way? And this strike is bringing that discussion forth.
It's interesting, John, because the telephone company, as we used to call it, is basically a quasi-governmental entity, because they're given all of these permissions and rights to use public lands and airwaves and so forth. So although I would tend to disagree with Alan saying, you know, give them their 26 weeks of unemployment, kick them in the butt and let them get out and find another job. But in this case, no, because it is kind of quasi-governmental, so they do need perhaps to be treated more humanely and be retrained. Do you agree? Or
I have sympathy for the unions in this case. And they're fighting a very uphill fight. Verizon wants to get out of the business. They're becoming a media company. They bought AOL. They're likely to buy Yahoo. They're becoming an entertainment company. So the union is fighting for job functions that, quite frankly, Verizon is no longer interested in.
Okay. I just, of course, was Charles was recoiling as I was talking about booting the workers in their pants. Just trying to elicit a little lively conversation. Not that heartless. What were you going to say, Alan?
Well, the problem, you see, is that corporations make these decisions. Management makes these decisions, whatever they are, but the workers have no say in them. Yes, right. And that's the real issue. I mean, if workers had a say in them in some basic way, then perhaps you might not get these strikes. And that goes to the basic dissatisfaction that many people have. You're buffeted about by big entities, whether the big entity be the government, or whether the big entity be a bank, or whether the big entity be your corporation. And I don't have a solution for that, but the politicians should be thinking about how do we bring in to the decision-making process the people who are actually affected. The executives are not going to be affected. They're still going to walk away with their salaries, their big bonuses, and their parachutes when they leave the company. But the workers are going to have to feel the brunt of this.
Part of the problem, and you were alluding to this before, is the sector is actually changing, Charles.
Yes, the sector is changing. It's a regulated business, including I think the fiber optic, because it is going on the poles, and you have to regulate that. The business is changing, but you still need the business. There are still millions of people who have landlines, and the business has to be maintained. It is regulated by the government, and the question is, the workers are then, since caught in the middle. Verizon is still supplying the service until they can find a buyer. And so everybody's caught in a tough tangle.
Is the business separate between Verizon Wireless and Verizon Communications, or is it all one and the same entity?
I'm not that familiar with it.
I'm not sure.
I'm not that familiar with it, but I do believe that the wireline, the old side of the
Landline.
business, yeah, it's called wireline, I think, in the industry. I think that's their slang for it. But nonetheless, there is a big broadband component, which is
Right.
FiOS.
Yes.
And that's actually doing quite well, from what I understand.
Fairly well, yeah.
Or fairly well, anyway. And so part of, I mean, you have to look at some of the details, and part of the complaints of the workers is that, okay, so maybe the actual landline business is not working out so well, but the broadband business is stable, and there's potential for expansion there. And they're complaining that why isn't the company paying more attention to that, which would have a beneficial effect for us and allow us to retain many jobs.
Well, I can tell you as a Time Warner customer who cannot get FiOS in my area, I would love for them to expand. And I would also like to see Google expand as well, because they're going to they're promising and installing high-speed internet as well. So it's all going to become more competitive, which of course will pressure Verizon workers.
Well,
even
of course,
more.
that benefits the workers. The workers have always benefited by being employees of this natural monopoly. And the monopoly rents tended to go to the state regulators are trying to lessen them, but frankly, there are monopoly rents. They're going to the company, they're going to the workers.
Right.
And that was the past.
So now that the monopoly is being broken up,
there
there's
is
less money to be had.
Less money to be had. You know, some areas of the business there is money to be had, but not like the good old days.
Right. John, we're turning to taxes for a little bit. The deadline this year is the 18th, because apparently Friday was some kind of holiday that I never heard of.
An important one.
What was it?
It's called Emancipation Day. I think that's the name of it.
Yes.
It's on April 16th, 1862.
Okay.
Congress
Emancipation
passed a law which emancipated slaves in D.C.
Okay.
So it's an important holiday in D.C., akin to an important state holiday.
Right.
So for Washington, D.C., this is an important moment. Occurred in the Lincoln administration. It prefaced the Emancipation Proclamation. So for D.C., it's important. And so the holiday actually falls today, but like all holidays, you move it back or you move it forward.
Gotcha.
So it was moved back to maybe the 18th.
Okay, well, thanks for that history lesson. I think I was absent that day in school. I think there was a Partridge Family marathon on, and I decided not to show up. Tell me a little bit about filing for last-minute filers. Should they just get an extension, sit down, do it right, take their time, or should they just file, John?
I would always tell everyone to take your time, do diligence. There's so much information out there for the average investor, and there's so many great professionals that can help you do that.
Is it too late to buy an IRA or those kind of things that can help you shelter a few bucks here and there?
For this tax cycle?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. Okay. Any last-minute tips for filers?
No, but you were mentioning refunds, and you know most people do get refunds. But speaking as an economist, and we have an accountant here, a refund is actually a silly thing to try to get for, because
Right.
you're loaning the money, you're loaning the government money at a zero interest rate.
Exactly. But the people who get that $1,500 bucks
Feel
or
good.
so feel good at the end of the year, and likely would not have saved that $1,500 bucks because
Possibly
we're
not. It's a way of
a nation
forced
of spenders.
Yeah, it's
Exactly.
a way of forced saving.
Exactly.
Everybody loves money back, even if
Right.
it's your own.
Yeah, exactly. The software today is so good, Alan. TurboTax, Tax Cut, Tax Act. It almost feels, if you're in a normal tax situation where you're not a small business owner or a corporation owner, you can just do it yourself, right?
Well, certainly for most taxpayers, they can do it themselves. But if you're thinking of planning ahead, if you're thinking of how do I invest, what should I buy, real estate, stocks, mutual funds and whatnot, and even more complicated transactions, then of course you do want a professional. But for most people, I think the software that's out there probably does the job.
But I think there's a danger in all the software doing it there. It's a lot easier to make the tax code and the individual return more complex and do a lot of things that you're completely unaware of.
Right.
And whereas in the old days, when you filled it out with a pencil and paper, you saw what was in the tax code.
Right.
You kind of understood. So
Because you're not even seeing the forms. You're just
No.
asking you questions and you're entering data. What I find the most annoying is the first question that tax software will ask you, do you have health insurance? And I feel like saying, none of your business. And then you answer, yes, I have health insurance. Is it provided by your employer? And again, I feel like saying, none of your business. But that's how intrusive this
Well,
government
this is the
has
Supreme
become.
Court ruled that the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is part of the tax code. And that's
Right.
where it's coming from.
And had it been approved under the Commerce Clause, you wouldn't have been asked that question. blame the Supreme Court.
Right. And so it just seems like it's not part of my taxes, but I'm answering the question anyway. One of the proposals has been to eliminate the IRS, and that's by Ted Cruz. Is that doable at all?
That's just red meat to the base, eliminate the IRS. But I think it's fair to say...
Well, if you had a flat tax, maybe you could
I love
eliminate
the idea of a flat tax.
Right.
I mean, taxes have become so easy that you hear less about the idea of simplifying the tax code, of doing a flat tax. I think it would be very good for the economy. But, this idea of eliminating the IRS, I don't think anyone takes that seriously. It's really, red meat for the...
You seem to chuckle at that prospect.
It's just silly. That might want to work for IRS, but it's just silly because somebody has to collect the taxes.
Right.
I mean,
right.
the money has to be collected. You have an agency.
It's fair to say there's a lot of redundant cost structures. I mean, you could make it more efficient.
And
obviously.
Congress, of course, gave IRS immense powers to really interfere. Then they blame IRS for using the authority that Congress gave them.
Right, right. So it's kind of a blame game. Like you said, it's red meat for the politicians. Final thoughts on tax day, Alan?
Well, pay your taxes, and I would follow the advice from my colleague here. Pay the right amount of taxes so that you actually have the money as you proceed, instead of waiting for that refund at the end of the year.
I don't know. I think for the average person, I think the average return is about $1,500, and the average refund is $1,500. For that person, that money would have went for an extra cup of latte at Starbucks each day, probably. And now they get a nice little check where they can go out and buy
So they
spring
buy
clothing.
big screen TV. It doesn't make a difference, really.
Exactly.
It really doesn't make a difference.
Exactly. Charles Steindel, Alain Sanders, John Boyd, thanks for your time. There's a whole lot more, a fresh outlook ahead. When we come back, it is time for the lightning round.